His wife took the house, the money, and the life a former Navy SEAL had fought to protect. But she made one mistake. She left him with his old German Shepherd K9. With nowhere else to go, Nolan followed Ridge through the northern woods to his grandmother's forgotten coastal cottage. Everyone said the place was worthless, rotten, and better left to the sea. Then Ridge stopped at the floorboards, and what he found beneath them changed everything. This was not just an old cottage. It was the truth his grandmother had hidden for decades. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran and Dog. The morning Nolan Alder Whitaker lost his house, he was making coffee. That was the detail that stayed with him later. Not the papers, not the lawyer's polished shoes, not even Vanessa's voice when she said the word divorce as if she were ordering a different kind of tea. It was the coffee. The grinder growled on the counter. The kettle breathed steam into the wide Vermont kitchen. Outside the tall windows, early winter had laid a pale silver veil over the birch trees. Frost clung to every branch, and the lawn beyond the glass looked too perfect, too still, like a photograph of a life that had never truly belonged to him. Nolan stood at the counter in his olive field jacket, the red and dark blue plaid shirt beneath it buttoned against the chill. He was 43, tall at 6'1", broad-shouldered and built with the hard, practical strength of a man trained to carry weight through mud, snow, and fear. His face was angular, the jaw cleanly cut beneath light stubble. Deep blue-gray eyes sat under short dark brown hair trimmed in a military cut, silver already touching both temples. War had not made him cruel, but it had carved silence into him. It had taught him to listen before moving. At his left wrist, an old military watch ticked softly. Near the table lay Ridge, his 7-year-old German Shepherd K9. Ridge was black and tan, short-coated, lean with compact muscle. His body balanced like a drawn bow even at rest. A dark brown leather K9 collar circled his neck, a small metal tag engraved with his name. He was not young anymore, but nothing in him was soft. His intelligent eyes kept watch even when his head rested on his paws. Nolan poured coffee into one mug. Then he reached for another out of habit. Vanessa always liked hers pale with cream. He stopped halfway. Something shifted in the hallway. Ridge lifted his head. The dog did not bark. That was the first warning. Ridge barked at raccoons, delivery men, and once, with great moral conviction, at a snowman built by the neighbor's grandchildren. But when danger entered a room wearing a human face, Ridge went quiet. His shoulders rose, his ears fixed forward, his eyes locked on the doorway. Vanessa came in first. She was 41, slender and polished, wrapped in a long camel wool coat over a cream turtleneck dress. Honey blonde hair fell in soft waves to her shoulders, arranged with the kind of care that made every strand look obedient. Her face was beautiful in a cold way, all sharp cheekbones and thin lips, her wedding ring still bright on her hand. Vanessa had always known how to look wounded before anyone had touched her. Behind her came two men. The first was Merritt Crane, though Nolan would only learn the name a moment later. He was in his mid-50s, thin, pale, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a dark blue tie. His short silver-gray hair was parted neatly, and his cold eyes carried the practiced fatigue of a man who had taken apart many lives and learned not to hear the sound. The second man was younger, around 45, in a navy suit cut too carefully to be casual. Derek Sloan had a long face, a pointed chin, dark hair slicked back with gel, and an expensive watch that flashed when he adjusted his cuff. His smile appeared and disappeared like something rented. Ridge stood. Nolan noticed Derek noticed the dog. Then Derek looked away. "Morning," Nolan said. Vanessa did not answer. She set her purse on the table. Merritt Crane placed his dark brown leather briefcase beside it and opened it with a soft click. Nolan looked from one face to another. The air in the kitchen changed. It became smaller, colder. A room he had built breakfasts in, repaired chairs in, held his wife through bad news in, suddenly felt like a briefing room before a raid. Vanessa folded her hands. "Nolan," she said. "I filed for divorce," the kettle screamed. For a second no one moved. Nolan turned off the burner. He had heard mortars land closer than they should. He had heard men pray into radios. He had heard silence after a call sign failed to answer. But this sound, the kettle dying under his hand while his wife stood 10 feet away with a lawyer, entered him differently. It did not explode. It sank. Merritt Crane cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, my name is Merritt Crane. I represent Vanessa. We would like to walk you through the proposed terms." Proposed. The word was a clean glove over a clenched fist. Nolan pulled out a chair and sat. Ridge moved beside him, close enough that Nolan felt the dog's flank brush his knee. Crane spread the papers across the kitchen table. Pages and pages. Nolan saw dates, initials, account numbers, corporate names he remembered Vanessa mentioning over the past 3 years. Restructuring, tax protection, risk management. Words she had said gently when he was newly out of service. when he was sleeping badly, when the doctors used careful voices and Vanessa said she only wanted to help him rest. Derek kept his eyes on the papers. Nolan watched him. A Navy SEAL did not survive by hearing only words. He watched hands, breathing, shoulders, the tiny surrender of a man's gaze when truth came too near. Crane explained that the house would remain with Vanessa. Her name held controlling interest through a financial structure Nolan had signed during what Crane called a period of medical transition. Several investment accounts had been moved into protected entities. Joint savings had been reduced through legal transfers. Vanessa, Crane said, had assumed primary administrative burden during Nolan's readjustment after military service. Administrative burden, Nolan almost smiled. That was one way to describe a theft wearing perfume. Vanessa's eyes shone, but not with tears. With readiness. She had rehearsed being sad. You told me those papers were for taxes, Nolan said. They were, Vanessa replied too quickly. In part, Ridge gave a low sound from his chest. Derek's fingers twitched against his cuff. And there, in that small movement, something inside Nolan went still. Not calm, not peace. Something older, harder. The part of him that had once stepped into dark rooms and known where the wires were before anyone saw them. This had not happened overnight. This was not a marriage ending. This was an operation, a campaign, a slow one. For 3 years, while Nolan learned how to sleep without checking corners, while he sat in rooms with therapists and tried to speak without feeling foolish, Vanessa and Derek had been moving pieces across a board he had not known existed. The thought should have broken him. Instead, it sharpened him. Crane continued, voice even. There is also the matter of Ridge. Nolan's hand moved at once to the dog's head. Vanessa sighed. I don't want the dog. Derek is allergic, and honestly, Nolan, Ridge belongs with you. You two have the same haunted stare. Derek gave a small laugh and killed it when Ridge looked at him. For the first time that morning, Nolan felt anger. Not for the house, not for the accounts. For Ridge. For the old K9 who had slept against his chest on nights when Nolan woke up unable to breathe. For the dog who had pulled him out of roadside dust and hospital dreams. For the only living creature in the room whose loyalty had never required a signature. Nolan looked at Vanessa. How long? Her face changed by half an inch. What? How long have you been with him? Crane lifted a hand. Mr. Whitaker, that is not relevant to the division of I'm not asking you. The kitchen fell silent. Vanessa glanced at Derek. One quick glance. Too quick. Almost a year, she said. Ridge growled again, softer this time. Nolan heard the lie the way a man hears thin ice crack under snow. Almost a year. A neat number. A number chosen because it sounded shameful, but survivable. A number meant to end the question. He did not press. Not yet. He only stored it away. Just as he stored the dates on the financial documents. Derek's cuff adjustment. Crane's phrase medical transition. Vanessa's wedding ring still shining as she dismantled the vows beneath it. Then Crane turned another page. There is one asset held solely in your name, he said. A cottage in Alder Cove, Maine, inherited from your maternal grandmother, Elowen Alder. The name struck Nolan harder than he expected. Elowen Alder rose in his mind as she had been in old photographs. A small, tough woman with a weathered face, white hair pinned in a low bun, and eyes bright enough to shame lighthouses. She had worn thick gray wool cardigans, old sea boots, and a pale blue scarf that always smelled faintly of salt. When Nolan was deployed overseas, her letters had arrived folded with tiny sketches of birds, tide lines, and sentences that somehow found him in the dark. The sea is still here, she had written once. It waits without asking why you were gone. Nolan had not visited her cottage in years. Vanessa laughed. It was brief, bright, and cruel. Oh, that place, she said. God, Nolan, take it, please. That rotten little bird box on the coast? The roof was failing when your grandmother was alive. You can drag your old war dog up there and play lonely hero all you want. Something in the room seemed to tilt, not visibly. The coffee mugs did not slide. The frost did not fall from the birches. But Nolan felt it, the way a sailor feels the deep water shift beneath a calm surface. Ridge stepped forward until his shoulder pressed firmly against Nolan's leg. The dog's eyes were not on Vanessa now. They were on Nolan. As if Ridge had heard something beneath the insult. As if the name Alder Cove had awakened a scent in the air, a buried trail, a door long shut but not locked. Nolan did not know then what waited in that forgotten cottage. He did not know why his grandmother had held on to it with such stubbornness, or why fate, with its dry and merciless humor, had let Vanessa laugh at the one thing she could not touch. But he felt, for one strange second, that the house in Vermont was not the place being taken from him. It was the place releasing him. Crane slid a packet forward. If you cooperate, this can remain private and efficient. Private and efficient. Nolan looked around the kitchen. The expensive stone counters, the shining appliances. The long table where he had once imagined children doing homework before life quietly decided otherwise. The cabinets he had installed himself during his first winter home because Vanessa had wanted something warmer, more traditional. None of it looked warm now. He stood. Vanessa stiffened. Derek took one half-step back before he could stop himself. Nolan gathered the coffee mugs from the counter. 4 of them now, though only one had been poured. Habit, training, old manners. He carried them to the sink. One by one, he rinsed them under hot water. The sound filled the kitchen, clean and ordinary, almost absurd. He washed Vanessa's mug, then his own, then the 2 he had taken out for men who had arrived to strip his life down to clauses. He set each cup upside down on the drying rack. Ridge watched him. Crane said nothing. Vanessa's face had gone pale with irritation. She had expected shouting, pleading, maybe the dangerous tremor she could later describe to a judge. She had not expected dishes. Nolan dried his hands on a towel hanging from the oven door. Then he turned. His voice was quiet. That made it worse. "Get out of my kitchen." "Nolan," Vanessa said. "All 3 of you." Crane closed his briefcase slowly. Derek avoided Ridge by 3 extra feet as he moved toward the hallway. Vanessa lingered as if waiting for one last wound to open on his face. It did not. She left with the men, the front door closed. For a while, Nolan stood alone in the wide kitchen, listening to the house settle around him. Outside, the birch trees shivered under a pale winter sun. Inside, the life he thought he had earned lay in ruins, but the ruins were strangely quiet. Ridge came to him. The German shepherd pressed his muzzle into Nolan's hand, then leaned his full weight against his leg. Nolan looked down at the old K9, at the steady eyes, the black and tan coat, the scar of years no court could divide. "All right," Nolan whispered. The words were not brave, they were only alive. He looked toward the table, where one document remained slightly crooked among the others. At the top of the page was the name of the asset Vanessa had laughed at, Alder Cove Cottage. Nolan placed his hand on Ridge's head. The house around him no longer felt like a home. It felt like a ship taking water. And for the first time that morning, Nolan understood something simple and brutal. A man did not have to go down with a ship just because he had helped build it. 3 days later, Nolan Alder Whitaker left the house in Vermont before sunrise. There was no grand farewell, no slammed door, no last speech spoken into the cold rooms. The house had already become a stranger, polished and silent, filled with furniture he had helped choose, and a life that had quietly learned to live without him. He packed 2 duffel bags. One held clothes. The other held the things that still felt true. A metal box of medals he rarely opened, his service records, a worn folder of medical papers, the deed to the cottage in Alder Cove, and a bundle of old letters tied with blue thread. Elo and Alder's letters. He also packed Ridge's bowl, Ridge's bed, a half-empty bag of food, and the old olive tactical leash that had been with them through more bad weather than most men survived. Ridge sat by the front door while Nolan loaded the truck, alert and still. The 7-year-old German Shepherd K9 did not whine. He did not pace. His black and tan body remained steady, his intelligent eyes following Nolan's every movement, as if counting the living things that mattered and finding only 2. When Nolan carried the last bag outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to pale behind the birch trees. Vanessa did not come out. That was mercy, or cowardice. Nolan did not waste time deciding which. He opened the passenger door. Ridge jumped in and settled beside the duffel bag, his muzzle resting on the worn canvas. Nolan stood for one moment beside the truck. The house loomed behind him, broad and expensive, every window dark. He had installed the kitchen shelves. He had repaired the porch rail after a March storm. He had planted the 2 young maples at the edge of the drive because Vanessa once said autumn should come closer to the house. Now the place looked untouched by him. That was the cruelty of certain endings. A man could pour years into a home and still leave no visible wound when he was removed from it. Nolan got behind the wheel. He did not look in the mirror when he drove away. For the first hour, the road was black and wet beneath the truck tires. Vermont rolled past in muted shades of gray, frost, and pine. Small towns still slept under church steeples and power lines. A diner glowed blue-white at the edge of a 2-lane road, but Nolan kept driving. Ridge dozed with one ear half raised. Nolan kept the radio off. Silence had been his oldest language. In the teams, silence meant readiness. In marriage, silence had become something else. It had become a room Vanessa decorated with accusations. "You never talk anymore. You look through me. You make this house feel like a hospital." He had believed her for too long. Now, with the road unwinding ahead and Ridge breathing beside him, Nolan began to understand that some silences were not emptiness. Some were shelters. Some were places where a wounded man kept the last pieces of himself from being handled carelessly. By mid-morning, he crossed into New Hampshire, and the sky lifted a little. Snow lay thin on the shoulders of the highway. Birch trunks flashed white between dark evergreens. The land brightened mile by mile, not cheerfully, exactly, but honestly. Winter did not pretend to be warm. It simply showed what endured. At a gas station near the Maine border, Nolan bought coffee, a bottle of water, and a plain biscuit wrapped in wax paper. He broke the biscuit in half and gave Ridge the smaller piece. Ridge took it delicately, then looked at the larger half in Nolan's hand. "No," Nolan said. "Don't start negotiating." Ridge blinked once. Nolan almost smiled. It felt strange on his face, like an old tool lifted from a drawer. Back on the road, the bundle of letters slid slightly on the seat between them. Nolan touched the blue thread with 2 fingers. Elowen Alder had been gone 14 years. She had died while Nolan was overseas, in a place of sand-colored walls and helicopter dust. The message reached him late through channels that made grief feel administrative. By the time he came home on leave, the funeral was over. Vanessa had gone with him to the small service, elegant in black, impatient by the second day. She had called the cottage a tax problem with shingles. His mother, Marian Alder, had already been dead by then for nearly 20 years. Marian appeared in Nolan's memory as a slim, dark-haired woman with gentle hands and tired hazel eyes. The kind of woman who sang quietly while washing dishes but carried sadness in her shoulders. She had been Elowen's only daughter, softer than her mother, less built for storms. Cancer had taken her when Nolan was 19, before he had become hard enough to know how young 19 really was. After Marian died, Elowen had become the last voice from that side of his blood, and he had left her cottage sleeping at the edge of the sea. Not because he did not care, because caring hurt. Because after war, after hospitals, after coming home to a wife who measured recovery by how quickly he became convenient again, he had not known how to face a house full of his grandmother's fingerprints. Vanessa had made it easy to avoid. "Someday," she had said, "we'll sell it eventually. No use dragging ghosts into our life." But ghosts, Nolan was learning, did not need invitation. They waited at the edge of the road until a man had nowhere else to go. By early afternoon, the highway thinned into smaller roads. The world grew brighter and wilder. Northern pines crowded close. White birches leaned over frozen ditches. Small lakes appeared between the trees, their surfaces catching pale clouds like pieces of broken mirror. Then, somewhere beyond a weathered sign for Knox County, Ridge lifted his head. The dog's nose moved. Nolan cracked the window. Cold air entered the truck, sharp with pine resin, wet stone, and something older, salt. The smell struck him low in the chest. Not memory exactly. Recognition. He was 8 years old again, standing beside Elowen on a black rock ledge while she pointed toward a gray line of water and told him that the sea had moods, not secrets. Secrets belonged to people. The sea only repeated what men tried to hide. Ridge pushed his muzzle toward the open window and inhaled deeply. "Yeah," Nolan said softly. "I know." Alder Cove came into view just after 3. It was smaller than Nolan remembered, though memory had a habit of enlarging childhood places until reality had to apologize. The town sat on a shelf of granite above the water. A white church leaned slightly into the wind. A bakery with fogged windows glowed at the corner of the main street. There was a narrow library, a post office, a hardware store with a faded red sign, and below all of it, a harbor holding fishing boats that rocked gently in their slips. The town looked lonely, but not dead. It looked like an old dog lifting its head because someone familiar had stepped onto the porch. Nolan followed the directions from the deed packet and an old note in Elowen's handwriting. Past the church, left where the spruce splits, down the road until doubt starts talking. Then keep going. He kept going. The paved road became gravel. Gravel became a rutted lane through tall spruce and pine. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. Ridge sat upright now, eyes bright, body alert. At last the trees opened. The cottage stood on a bluff above a rocky cove. For a moment, Nolan could only stare. The roof had gone silver with age. The porch sagged toward one corner. 2 windows were cracked, one patched with cloudy plastic. Wild rose vines climbed through the broken rail, their thorned branches bare except for a few stubborn red hips. Behind the cottage, the land sloped into pine woods. Beyond it, the Atlantic moved in cold blue-gray folds under the afternoon light. It should have looked ruined. Instead, it looked patient. Nolan stepped out of the truck. Ridge jumped down beside him, sniffed the ground, then froze. The dog lowered his head and pulled hard against the leash. Nolan stopped. One boot had been about to land on the first porch board. Ridge pulled again, backward this time. Nolan trusted him. He stepped aside. The board gave way with a wet crack and dropped into the dark space beneath the porch. Nolan looked down at the hole. Rotten wood, damp underneath. The sour smell of old moisture rose into the air. Ridge looked up at him. "Noted," Nolan said. "No heroic entrances." A voice came from the trees. "You always talk to the dog like he outranks you?" Nolan turned. An old man stood at the edge of the lane holding a small axe in one hand and a battered metal coffee thermos in the other. He was around 72, thin and slightly stooped, with a sun-weathered face, pale gray eyes, and messy white and silver hair beneath a gray knit cap. A faded brown canvas jacket hung over a brown-gray wool sweater patched at both elbows. His boots were muddy, his expression cautious, and his hands had the permanent roughness of a life spent working outdoors. Nolan did not move his hand far from Ridge's collar. "Depends on the day," he said. The old man studied him. "You lost?" "No. People who aren't lost don't usually come down this road in November. I'm Nolan Whitaker. Elowyn Alder was my grandmother." The old man's face changed. Not much. Just enough. The suspicion did not vanish, but grief stepped beside it. "Silas Fenner," he said. "I lived down the road. Knew Elowyn. Knew her before most folks here decided she was odd and after they decided she was harmless." "She wasn't harmless?" Silas looked toward the cottage. "No. She was good. People confuse those when it suits them." He walked closer, careful around the broken porch board. Ridge watched him but did not growl. Silas noticed that. Smart dog. Smarter than most people I met this week. That earned the smallest twitch at the corner of Silas's mouth. Together, they forced open the swollen front door. It took Silas's axe handle, Nolan's shoulder, and several words Elowyn would not have approved of. When the door finally gave, the cottage released a breath of cold air smelling of dust, old wood, lamp oil, and sea wind, trapped too long indoors. Inside were 4 small rooms, a front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a black iron stove and a pump sink, a narrow bedroom with an iron bedstead, a rear storage room lined with shelves, tools, coils of rope, and lanterns gone cloudy with age. Silas showed Nolan where the well sat, how the stove drew best, which window needed covering before nightfall, and which boards near the back wall could not be trusted. He moved through the cottage like a man walking through a memory that had not forgiven him. "Elowyn built more of this place than folks know," Silas said. "Laid floorboards, set stone, kept a lamp in that front window when fog came in thick. Said a light was a promise you made before anyone asked for help." Nolan ran his hand over the mantel. Dust came away on his fingers. "She never told me that. She didn't tell most people what mattered. She waited for them to prove they could listen." The light outside began to fade. Silas patched one broken window with plastic from his truck and left Nolan a stack of dry kindling without asking payment. At the door, he paused and looked down at Ridge. The old dog stood beside Nolan, calm now as if the cottage had already been added to his patrol route. Silas's weathered face tightened with an emotion he quickly buried. "Elowyn said something once," he murmured. "Long time ago." Nolan waited. Silas looked from Ridge to the darkening woods. "She said if her grandson ever came back broken enough to hear the place properly, a good dog would know where to stop first." Then he seemed to regret saying it. He pulled his cap lower. "Forget that. Old people say strange things." But Nolan did not forget, neither did Ridge. That night, Nolan laid Ridge's bed near the stove and unrolled his own sleeping bag on the floor. He ate beans from a can warmed over the little fire while Ridge crunched kibble from the old metal bowl. Wind moved through the pines outside. The cove below the bluff struck the rocks again and again, steady as breath. The cottage creaked, not threateningly, more like an old body shifting under a blanket. Near midnight, Nolan woke with his heart hammering, one hand reaching for a weapon that was not there. For a moment he was nowhere. Not Vermont, not Maine, not home. Just darkness and the old animal certainty that something was coming. Then Ridge was against him. The German shepherd pressed his chest across Nolan's ribs, heavy and warm, grounding him with the practiced weight of a partner who knew the drill. Nolan gripped the dark fur at Ridge's shoulder and forced air into his lungs. The fire had settled into red coals. Outside, the sea kept moving. After a while, Nolan whispered, "I'm here." Ridge did not move. Nolan listened to the wind in the pines, to the old cottage standing around him, to the dog breathing against his side. For the first time since Vanessa had walked into the kitchen with a lawyer, the room did not feel like it wanted something from him. It felt like it was waiting. And maybe, for one night, waiting was enough. The first week at Alder Cove did not heal Nolan Alder Whitaker. It humbled him. By the second morning, the pump behind the cottage refused to give water. By the third, the stove smoked so badly that Ridge sneezed 6 times, then stared at Nolan with the grave disappointment of a commanding officer reviewing a failed operation. By the fourth, a mouse ran across the pantry shelf carrying what appeared to be a piece of Nolan's emergency cracker. And Ridge, a trained K9 who had once tracked men through rain and ruined concrete, looked personally insulted. Nolan had survived deserts, black water, frozen ridgelines, and rooms where silence had teeth. But the cottage had its own kind of warfare. It did not attack all at once. It asked for small things and asked it again. Patch this window, split that log, clear this gutter, prime the pump, sweep the ash, find where the wind is slipping under the door. Keep the fire alive. Wake up and do it again. The first time Nolan tried to split kindling, the old axe glanced off the damp wood and buried itself in the chopping block at a crooked angle. He stood there in his olive field jacket, dark blue cargo pants tucked into worn brown boots, the sleeves of his red and dark blue plaid shirt rolled up despite the cold. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw locked beneath light stubble, deep blue-gray eyes fixed on the stubborn log like it had insulted his ancestors. Ridge sat nearby in the snow, black and tan coat bright against the white ground, his old dark brown leather K9 collar dark with frost. "You want to say something?" Nolan asked. Ridge yawned. Professional courtesy would be appreciated. The dog lay down. By noon, Nolan's palms were blistered. By nightfall, he had a pile of kindling small enough to be embarrassing, but large enough to keep the stove breathing until dawn. He learned to bank the coals the way Silas Fenner had shown him, slow, patient, with ash tucked over the red heart of the fire like a blanket over a sleeping animal. Silas came by most mornings without announcing himself. The 72-year-old neighbor would appear from the trees in his faded brown canvas jacket, patched wool sweater, muddy boots, and gray knit cap, carrying coffee that tasted like punishment and advice that sounded like criticism until Nolan realized it was kindness wearing work gloves. "Don't swing from the shoulder," Silas told him one morning. "Let the axe fall. Wood splits when you stop arguing with it." That advice apply to people? Silas looked at him. "People are worse than wood." Then he spat into the snow and showed him again. Ridge became the clock of the cottage. At sunrise, he dragged Nolan's gloves to the sleeping bag and dropped them beside his face. If Nolan ignored him, Ridge pressed one cold nose under his chin. If Nolan stayed too long staring at nothing, Ridge brought his metal bowl and set it on Nolan's boot with a clang. Food, water, fire, work. Ridge reduced grief to orders simple enough to follow. Some mornings that saved Nolan. Other mornings, the dog lay directly in the path between Nolan and the door, forcing a former Navy SEAL who had once crossed hostile terrain under fire to perform an undignified sidestep around a stubborn German shepherd with the moral authority of a judge. "You know," Nolan muttered, stepping over him, "there are easier ways to motivate a man." Ridge thumped his tail once. The sound was small, but in that cold cottage it felt almost like laughter. On the 9th day, Nolan repaired the pump. It took 4 hours, a skinned knuckle, and a level of profanity that made him glance once at Elowen's old stove, as if his grandmother might still disapprove from the ironwork. The problem was simple once he found it: a cracked leather washer and a line that had not been properly primed. Silas had left the part in a jar on the pantry shelf without mentioning it, which was very nearly his style of affection. When clear water finally burst from the spout, Nolan stood there with both hands wet in pine sap on his sleeve. The phone buzzed in his pocket. "Vanessa." He almost let it ring out. Then he answered. "Nolan," she said, her voice smooth with false concern. "Are you still pretending that place is livable?" He looked at the pump. Behind him, Ridge lowered his head, sensing the shift in Nolan's breathing. "It is livable." A soft laugh came through the line. "You couldn't sleep in a finished house without checking the locks 3 times. You think you're going to survive winter alone in the woods with that old dog?" Nolan wiped one wet hand on his cargo pants. The old version of him might have defended himself. Explained. Tried to make her understand the difference between fear and vigilance, injury and weakness, silence and absence. But the cottage had taught him something already. Some doors wasted heat. He looked toward the thin smoke rising from the chimney he had coaxed back to life. "I fixed the pump this morning," he said. Vanessa went quiet, not because she cared, because it was not the answer she wanted. "Don't call again unless it comes through attorneys," Nolan said. He ended the call. For a long moment he stood still in the yard, the phone cold in his hand, while the pines moved above him and the cove struck the rocks below. Then Ridge picked up one of Nolan's gloves from the snow and trotted away with it. "Ridge." The dog kept going. "Ridge, I'm having a moment." Ridge disappeared behind the cottage. Nolan followed, irritated enough to be alive. The dog stopped beneath a large old pine at the rear of the property. Its roots rose from the ground like the knuckles of a buried hand. Ridge dropped the glove, lowered his nose, and began pawing at the snow around the base of the tree. Nolan frowned. "What is it?" Ridge pawed again, harder. He was not digging wildly. He was working a scent. Metal, maybe. Whetstone. Something different beneath pine needles and frozen earth. Nolan knelt and cleared the snow with his bare hands. Under the needles was a flat stone, dark with age. He brushed away the dirt until a mark appeared. A single carved letter. A. The sight ran through him with a strange, quiet force. Not fear, not proof. Recognition, as if the land had spoken his grandmother's name in the only language Stone knew. That afternoon, an envelope arrived at the small Alder Cove post office. The postmistress, Mrs. Cora Bell, was a round, brisk woman in her 60s, with silver curls, pink cheeks, and the sharp eyes of someone who had sorted not only male but human weakness for 40 years. She handed the envelope to Nolan across the counter and looked at the return address longer than necessary. North Glass Development, she said. They've been sniffing around the coast for 2 years. Nolan studied the heavy cream paper. Friendly? Nothing printed on paper that expensive is friendly. She was right. The letter informed him, in clean corporate language, that a recent survey suggested portions of the rear Woodland Trail and access path descending toward the cove might fall under a development claim held by North Glass. It invited him to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement before further procedural action became necessary. Nolan read it twice on the post office steps. He knew that voice. It was the same voice Merritt Crane had used in his kitchen, a knife wrapped in a napkin. When he returned to the cottage, Silas was waiting near the woodpile, squinting at the letter as though it smelled bad. "You need Mara Bellamy," he said. "Who is that?" "Lawyer, former JAG. Helps veterans when the world gets clever with paperwork." Mara Bellamy's office sat above the hardware store on Main Street. She was 51, with straight posture, dark eyes that did not drift when a man spoke, and black shoulder-length hair threaded with silver and tied low at the nape of her neck. She wore a dark navy trench coat over a black turtleneck, dark gray trousers, low black leather boots, and carried a brown leather document bag polished by use rather than vanity. She did not greet Nolan with pity. That alone made him trust her more. She read the North Glass letter, then the deed, then the papers Nolan had brought from Vermont. Her expression remained controlled, but one finger tapped once against the desk when she saw Derek Sloan's name in the financial restructuring documents. "Your cottage is separate inherited property," she said. "That helps. But you are still in an active divorce. If this land suddenly gains financial value, Vanessa may try to argue related benefit, especially if she claims marital funds maintained it." She called it a bird box. People often insult what they later intend to take. Nolan looked toward the window. Down on the street, Ridge waited beside the truck, scanning passing cars as if Main Street were a checkpoint. "And North Glass?" Mara leaned back. "They are testing you. Newly separated veteran, limited cash, medical history they may try to twist. Remote property. They expect you to get tired before they do. They don't know me." "No," Mara said. "But do not make the mistake of fighting them like a soldier when you need to fight them like a record keeper. Photograph everything. Map everything. Save every envelope. No angry calls, no private deals." Nolan nodded, that he understood. Observation, documentation, patience. The old gods of survival wearing civilian clothes. For the next 2 days, Nolan followed Ridge and the old pine line through the rear woods. Whenever the dog stopped and worked the ground, Nolan dug carefully. He found 3 more stones, each marked with the same carved A. Some were nearly buried. One had been covered by moss so thick it looked like part of the forest floor. He photographed them, marked coordinates on his phone, and drew the line on a copy of the survey Mara had given him. Silas came with him on the 2nd day. When Nolan uncovered the 4th marker, the old man went very still. "Elowen set these," Silas said. "You saw her?" Silas looked away toward the bright winter trees. "I saw more than I said back then." The word sits between them, old and heavy. Nolan did not push. Not yet. That evening, Ridge refused to come inside. He stood at the rear of the cottage, nose lifted toward the storage room wall, ears forward. Snow had begun falling in small bright flakes. Nolan called him twice. The dog did not move. Finally, Nolan brought a flashlight. Ridge pressed his nose against a warped plank near the back of the storage room, then scratched once, not frantic. Certain. The wood smelled of dust, old oil, and damp paper. Nolan worked the edge loose with a flat screwdriver from Elowen's tool shelf. The plank came away with a groan. Behind it sat a rusted tin box. Inside was a brass key, dark with age, and a folded strip of paper. Nolan opened it under the flashlight. The handwriting was Elowen's, small and steady. "If the woods are challenged, look beneath the bedroom floor. Do not trust a map with no footprints." Nolan read it once, then again. Behind him, Ridge sat down, calm now, as if his part of the work was finished for the night. Outside, the pines whispered under falling snow. The cottage, which had first seemed like a ruin, now felt less like a house and more like an old witness slowly deciding to speak. Nolan closed his hand around the brass key. For the first time since arriving at Alder Cove, he felt the shape of something larger than survival. Not victory, not revenge, a trail. And Ridge had found the first true mark. Nolan Alder Whitaker did not go into Elowen's bedroom the next morning. He told himself there were practical reasons. The back window still leaked cold air. The woodpile needed stacking before the next storm. The North Glass letter needed copies. Mara Bellamy had told him to document everything. and a man who had spent half his life trusting preparation over hope did not ignore instructions that made sense. But the truth was simpler. He was afraid of that room, not of ghosts. Nolan had seen enough death to know the living carried the heavier hauntings. He was afraid of the smell behind that closed door. Old wool, cedar, lamp oil, and the faint salt-dry scent of a woman who had loved him before he knew how much that mattered. Ridge knew. The 7-year-old German Shepherd K9 watched him from beside the stove, deep intelligent eyes following every unnecessary task Nolan found. Ridge's black and tan coat caught the morning light from the repaired window. His old dark brown leather canine collar lay against his thick neck, the small metal tag dull with age. He did not push Nolan toward the room, not yet. That was the thing about Ridge. He knew when to block a doorway and when to let a man pretend he was choosing another road, so Nolan chose the woods. Silas Fenner arrived after breakfast, smelling of coffee, smoke, and cold air. The 72-year-old neighbor looked even more weathered in daylight, his thin frame slightly stooped inside his faded brown canvas jacket, patched wool sweater, and old dark work pants. His gray knit cap sat low over white and silver hair. His pale eyes were sharp but tired, as if they had spent decades looking at something he could not bring himself to name. Nolan held up the rough map he had drawn from the boundary stones. "I want to follow the line." Silas looked at the paper, then at Ridge, then toward the pines behind the cottage. "Figured you would." They set out under a bright winter sky. The forest behind the cottage was not dark like the woods in stories meant to frighten children. It was clean and cold and luminous. Snow rested in white seams along fallen logs. Sunlight slipped through spruce branches in thin gold shafts. The air smelled of resin, stone, and the distant Atlantic. Ridge moved ahead on the olive tactical leash, nose low, muscles controlled. He did not drag them blindly. He worked the land with patient discipline, stopping where scent changed, circling old roots, pausing at patches of moss-covered stone. The first 2 markers matched Nolan's notes. The third stood beside a frozen creek, half swallowed by fern roots. The fourth was beyond a slope of granite, where the trees thinned and the sound of the cove rose louder below. Each stone bore the same carved letter, A. Alder. A claim not shouted but kept. They crossed the creek on a fallen cedar. Silas moved more slowly there, one hand gripping a branch, his jaw tight from old knees and older memories. Nolan offered an arm without speaking. Silas accepted without thanks. That, too, seemed to be his language. Past the creek, Ridge stopped, his ears lifted. Ahead, under a curtain of dead ferns and snow-bent brush, something leaned crookedly between 2 spruce trunks. Nolan brushed it clear. A wooden sign emerged, gray and rotted, the carved letters nearly eaten away. Alder Watch Trail. Silas made a sound that was not quite breath and not quite pain. Nolan looked at him. "You know this trail." Silas took off his cap and rubbed a hand over his white hair. "Everybody did once," he said. "Then everybody learned to forget." The trail curved along the ridge above the cove. It was narrow, cut carefully through stone and root, not a deer path but a human one. Every 100 yards or so they found the remains of small iron hooks fixed into trees or rock faces. Some were rusted to almost nothing, others still held fragments of old glass. "Lantern points," Silas said. Nolan crouched near one. "For boats, for fog." Silas's voice had gone low. Before the newer harbor lights, folks along this cove kept small lamps on bad nights. Not official, not pretty, just enough. Elowin and Jonas checked this trail when the fog rolled in, made sure the lamps burned where they needed to. Jonas. The name had lived in Nolan's family like a photograph turned face down. His grandfather appeared now in Nolan's mind from the few pictures that survived. A sturdy fisherman around 50, square-faced. Sun-darkened, with kind, strong eyes, wind-tousled brown hair touched with silver, and a fuller beard than Nolan's own light stubble. In the old photo Nolan remembered best, Jonas Alder wore a thick navy sweater under a deep yellow sea jacket, black rubber boots planted wide on a dock, one hand resting on a coil of rope and the other around Elowin's shoulders. He did not look reckless. He looked like a man who knew weather well enough to respect it. "They said he went out when he shouldn't have," Nolan said. Silas stared down the trail. "That's what they said. And what do you say?" The old man did not answer at first. Wind moved through the pines. Ridge stood still between them, eyes fixed on Silas, not accusing, not comforting, just watching. Finally, Silas said, "I say some lies get told so many times they start wearing church clothes." They walked farther. The trail opened to a narrow overlook above the water. Below, the Atlantic struck black stone and burst white. Across the cove, the cliffside showed old scars where trees should have held the earth. The cuts were softened now by decades of moss and brush, but Nolan saw the shape of damage. Silas pointed with one rough hand. There used to be a stand of spruce there, thick enough to break wind, hold the slope. Company came through in '86. Not Northglass by name, not then. An older outfit. Different sign on the trucks, same hunger under the paint. He swallowed. They cut where they weren't supposed to. Nights mostly. Folks heard engines. Saw lights. But work was work back then, and a man with a mortgage learns how to close curtains. Nolan said nothing. Silas looked smaller suddenly, as if confession stole height. I was 32, had a young wife, a baby girl, job with the county. I saw trucks on the restricted road 2 nights before Jonas went missing. I saw Elowen at the town office after, holding photographs and notes, begging somebody to look at the slope. They laughed without laughing. You know the kind, Nolan knew. Men did not always mock with noise. Sometimes they mocked with patience. Silas's voice broke rougher. She asked me to say what I saw, and you didn't. Silas shook his head once. No. The word fell into the snow between them and stayed there. For a moment Nolan felt anger rise, not hot, cold, precise. He imagined Elowen standing alone in some office, small and weathered, her gray cardigan smelling of sea wind, carrying proof no one wanted because truth would inconvenience men with clean hands. But then he looked at Silas, at the bent shoulders, the old guilt, the way the man could not meet the sea. Nolan knew something about surviving a moment and paying for it forever. He had his own rooms he did not enter. Ridge stepped forward then, not toward the trail, toward Silas. The German shepherd pressed his nose once against the old man's hand. Silas froze. His fingers opened slowly, as if he had forgotten they could receive anything but blame. Ridge remained there, calm and steady. Silas covered his face with his other hand. It was not forgiveness. Dogs did not absolve men like priests. But Ridge had done something more dangerous. He had recognized sorrow without fearing it. Silas lowered his hand. His eyes were wet, though the cold gave him an excuse. Elowen always trusted dogs, he said hoarsely, said they could smell the difference between fear and evil. Nolan looked out over the cove. And what were you? Silas closed his eyes, afraid. The answer did not repair anything, but it was true. And truth, Nolan was learning, was sometimes only the first board laid across a washed-out bridge. While Nolan walked the old trail, Vanessa Whitaker was learning that the cottage she had mocked might not be as worthless as she needed it to be. The call came that evening, after Nolan had returned to town, to send copies of the new photographs to Mara. He did not hear it, but Mara would later show him the pattern. Derek Sloan making inquiries, a North Glass consultant requesting parcel histories, Vanessa's attorney asking whether improvements to inherited property during an active divorce could create marital considerations. In a Boston hotel bar far from the Pine Woods, Derek Sloan sat across from Vanessa with 2 untouched drinks between them. His navy suit was immaculate, his dark hair glossy under amber lights, but his eyes moved too often. Vanessa wore her camel coat open over the cream dress, honey blonde hair smooth, wedding ring still displayed like a prop in a trial no one had called yet. If North Glass is interested, Derek said, there's value. Vanessa's thin lips tightened. He cannot manage value. He can barely manage himself. Derek did not disagree. That was the shape of their next attack. Not the land first. Nolan. By the time Nolan returned to the cottage, Mara Bellamy had left a message. Do not speak to Vanessa. Do not sign anything. Keep document. We may need to establish protective structure fast. Nolan listened to it twice, then put the phone face down. He did not go to Elowen's bedroom. Not that night. The next morning, snow fell soft and bright. The cottage seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls had heard Silas speak and were considering what to do with the sound. Ridge stood outside the bedroom door. Nolan found him there after breakfast. The dog did not scratch. He did not whine. He simply stood, head lowered, ears forward, gaze fixed on the threshold. Nolan's hand tightened around the small old key he had kept in his jacket pocket since the night before. All right, he said. The bedroom smelled exactly as he had feared. Cedar, wool, dust, lamp oil, and under it all the faint sweetness of old paper protected from damp. The room was small. An iron bed stood beneath the window. A pale quilt lay folded at the foot. A gray cardigan hung from a peg, its sleeves empty and patient. On the dresser sat a chipped saucer holding 3 smooth stones from the cove. Nolan stood in the doorway too long. Ridge moved past him. The dog went to the far side of the bed, lowered his nose to the floor, and stopped at one wide pine board near the wall. He sniffed along the seam, then looked back. Nolan knelt. The board was different. Not obviously. The grain matched. The color matched. But the nails were wrong. Wooden plugs had been fitted into place by hands that knew exactly how to hide a secret from everyone except someone willing to kneel. He worked the plugs loose. The old key turned a small hidden latch beneath the edge. The board lifted. Below it sat a small cedar chest wrapped in oil-dark cloth. Nolan did not open it. Not yet. He lifted it out with both hands and set it on the bedroom floor. It was heavier than it looked. Ridge lay down beside him, his body warm against Nolan's leg. Outside, the snow brightened the pines until the whole forest seemed lit from within. Nolan rested one hand on the lid. For 14 years, this room had waited. For longer than that, perhaps. Elowen had waited inside what she had left behind. Nolan bowed his head, not in defeat this time, but in the terrible humility of a man about to hear the dead speak truth. And for the first time since leaving Vermont, he whispered to his grandmother as if she were just beyond the wall. "I'm listening now." Nolan Alder Whitaker opened the cedar chest at dawn. He had waited through most of the night with one hand resting on the lid, as if warmth from his palm could ask permission from the dead. Ridge lay beside him on the bedroom floor, the 7-year-old German Shepherd K9 breathing slow and steady, his black and tan body curled close to Nolan's leg. The fire in the other room had fallen low, and through the small bedroom window, winter light gathered over the pines like a promise that had not yet decided whether to keep itself. When Nolan finally lifted the lid, the smell rose first: cedar, old paper, lamp oil, salt. Inside were 14 notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, each tied with faded blue thread. Beneath them lay folded tide maps, pencil sketches of cliffside lantern posts, pressed seaweed sealed between wax paper, small envelopes marked with bird feathers, black and white photographs, unanswered letters, and several cassette tapes labeled in Elowen Alder's careful hand. Nolan did not move for a long moment. He had expected a few family papers, maybe old tax records, maybe a deed, a photograph, some memory too tender to survive daylight. He had not expected a life's work. Ridge lifted his head and sniffed the chest. His ears angled forward, but he did not paw at anything now. His work had been to find it. Nolan understood that the rest belonged to human courage. He untied the first notebook. The pages were filled edge to edge with dates, times, wind direction, water temperature, tide level, animal tracks, bird calls, and sketches so precise they seemed less drawn than witnessed. Elowen had recorded where seals hauled out in late winter, where small salmon returned in spring, where cliff swallows nested when the wind came from the northeast. She had noted which lanterns along Alder Watch Trail were visible from the lower cove, which ones vanished in fog, and which ones needed clearing after storms. She wrote like a scientist. She wrote like a woman praying with a ruler in her hand. Nolan turned page after page, his broad shoulders bent under the low morning light. His deep blue-gray eyes moved over the handwriting of a grandmother who had been called odd by people who never bothered to ask what she knew. One photograph showed Elowen in her late 60s, small but upright, wearing her thick gray wool cardigan, pale blue shirt, long dark brown skirt, old sea boots, and the pale sea blue scarf Nolan remembered from childhood. Her white hair was pinned in a low bun, loose strands windblown at her temples. She stood beside a lantern post on the cliff, one hand on the wood, her face weathered and serious. Beside that photograph was another, Jonas Alder. Nolan's grandfather stood on a dock in a thick navy sweater and old deep yellow sea jacket, black rubber boots planted wide. He was sturdy, square-faced, sun-darkened, with wind-tousled brown hair, streaked silver, and a fuller beard than Nolan's. His eyes looked kind, but not careless. He looked like a man who understood that the sea was never an enemy, only a power that punished arrogance. Nolan held the photograph for a long time. The town had called Jonas reckless. The photograph disagreed. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the first stack of journals, Nolan found a letter sealed in a brittle envelope. For Nolan, if he comes back, his name in Elowen's handwriting struck him harder than any accusation Vanessa had ever thrown. He opened it carefully. "My dear boy, if you are reading this, then either the cottage has outlived me, or grief has finally done what love could not and brought you home. I am sorry for that. No grandmother wants pain to be the road her child must walk. But sometimes the Lord does not send us a map. Sometimes he sends us a dog with a better nose than our pride." Nolan stopped. A laugh broke out of him before he could stop it. It was rough, almost painful, but real. Ridge raised his head, gave him a long look, then rested his chin back on Nolan's boot as if he accepted the compliment on behalf of all righteous dogs. Nolan kept reading. They said Jonas was foolish. They said he went out when the fog was too thick and the wind had turned. They said a fisherman should know better. He did know better. Your grandfather respected the sea more than any man I ever knew. The night he died, the third lantern should have been visible from the lower channel. It was not. The spruce line had been cut illegally above the west slope. The earth shifted. The post leaned. The light turned inland where no boat could see it. I walked the line. I measured the ground. I photographed the tire tracks. I wrote down names. I sent letters. No one wanted an old widow's truth, so I kept it. Nolan lowered the letter. The room had become very still. Not quiet, still, as if the cottage itself were listening to the words finally being read aloud inside its walls. Ridge stood suddenly. The dog moved to the chest and pressed his nose against one of the cassette tapes. He did not bark. He simply touched it, then looked at Nolan. The tape label read, Lantern 3, November 1986. Nolan felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. There it was, not magic, not a ghost, not thunder from heaven, just a dog's nose catching old plastic, dust, oil, perhaps the faint trace of human hands long gone. Yet in that moment it felt as if Mercy had leaned down into the room and pointed. Nolan borrowed an old cassette player from Silas that afternoon. Silas brought it wrapped in a towel, his weathered face guarded, his patched wool sleeves smelling of cold and wood smoke. He did not ask what Nolan had found. Perhaps he could not bear to ask. Perhaps he already knew that truth, once awake, did not need permission to stand. The machine hissed, clicked, and then Elowen's voice filled the cottage, thin with age, warm beneath the static. "If this still works," she said, "then let it be known that I trusted 3 things in this life: the tide, old women, and working dogs. All 3 will tell the truth if men stop making speeches long enough to pay attention." Nolan closed his eyes. Ridge sat very straight beside the table, ears forward, solemn as a soldier at a memorial, and just ridiculous enough to keep the grief from swallowing the room whole. Elowen continued. She spoke of the night Jonas died, of fog thick as wool, of lanterns checked at dusk, of the third light dimmed and turned by a shifted slope, of tire marks above the ridge, of a logging company with a different name than Northglass, but with investors whose names appeared again decades later in coastal development filings. Mara Bellamy came the next day. The 51-year-old former JAG lawyer stood in Elowen's kitchen wearing her dark navy trench coat, black turtleneck, dark gray trousers, and low black leather boots. Her black hair, threaded with silver, was tied low. Her direct dark eyes moved over the notebooks, photographs, and tapes with the discipline of someone who knew evidence could be sacred if handled correctly. "This is not something we wave around for attention," Mara said. "Not yet. We verify, we copy, we preserve chain of custody where we can, and Nolan, Vanessa cannot know the full value of this before we understand it ourselves. She already knows enough to want a piece." Mara's mouth tightened. "Then we make sure she gets nothing she can twist." She found Derek Sloan's name again 2 hours later, not in Elowen's materials, but in the modern corporate records she had begun pulling. Derek had advised a small investment group tied to Northglass's coastal acquisitions, not openly, not as a headline, but there, in filings, disclosures, and consultant lists. Vanessa, Derek, and Northglass were not separate storms. They were weather moving from the same pressure system. By the end of the week, Vanessa's attorney sent a formal message claiming concern for Nolan's judgment. The language was polished and poisonous. It suggested that Nolan had become fixated on the cottage, that his reliance on Ridge indicated emotional instability, and that any major decision regarding inherited property during pending divorce should be reviewed for competency and marital impact. Nolan read it once. His hand did not shake, but Ridge felt the change in him anyway. The German Shepherd rose from beside the stove and placed himself between Nolan and the door, head lowered, body steady, not aggressive, protective. A living wall of loyalty against words meant to make a wounded man doubt his own mind. Nolan crouched and pressed his forehead briefly against Ridge's. "She's using you now," he whispered. "That's low, even for her." Ridge licked his cheek once. Mara took the message from Nolan's hand. "Good. Let them overreach. Courts dislike people who weaponize service injuries and medical history without cause." Then she looked toward the journals. "But we need science, not just memory." That was how Nolan first met Dr. Laurel Keene. Laurel worked out of a small coastal research station 40 minutes south. She was 40, with a healthy fieldwork build, lightly tanned skin, and focused green-brown eyes that missed very little. Chestnut hair, cut around her chin and wind-messy, escaped from beneath a knit cap. She wore a gray-blue field jacket over a cream thermal shirt, dark olive trekking pants, brown hiking boots, and carried a small field backpack with binoculars hanging from one strap. She was polite, but not easily impressed. At the cottage table, Laurel opened the first journal with gloved hands and studied Elowen's notes. Her expression did not soften. If anything, it became more guarded. "I need to be honest," she said. "Families often believe old records are more significant than they are. The consistency here is remarkable. But remarkable can mean 2 things. It can mean valuable or it can mean embellished." Nolan felt heat rise behind his ribs. Ridge, lying under the table, pressed one paw against his boot. "A reminder. Hold. My grandmother doesn't need you to believe her today," Nolan said. "She needs you to check her fairly." Laurel looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "That," she said, "I can do." She took 3 notebooks, copies of the maps, and photographs of the specimen envelopes. She signed a receipt Mara prepared. She handled every page like a skeptic, yes, but also like someone who knew fragility deserved manners. The waiting lasted nearly 2 weeks. Nolan worked because waiting without work was a dangerous room. He stacked wood, patched the pantry wall, marked more boundary lines, copied Elowen's letters late into the night while Ridge slept across his feet. Some evenings he played the cassette tapes and listened to his grandmother describe wind, light, grief, and stubbornness until the cottage felt less empty. Then, on a morning when the snow began to loosen from the roof and drip in bright threads from the eaves, Laurel returned. Her field truck rolled up the lane muddy and loud. She stepped out holding one of Elowen's notebooks against her chest. Her face had changed. The guarded skepticism was still there, but something had broken open beneath it. Wonder, maybe, or apology. Nolan met her in the yard. Ridge stood beside him, ears forward, tail still. Laurel looked from the dog to Nolan. "There is a cliff nesting turn in the second notebook," she said. "Your grandmother recorded it in a sheltered basalt pocket northeast of the lower cove. Specific wind pattern, specific tide window, specific stone formation. That species has not been confirmed nesting here in decades." Nolan waited. Laurel swallowed. "We found a pair." The cove sounded below them, water striking rock in steady applause. "Exactly where she said they would be?" Nolan asked. Laurel nodded, her voice lower now. "Exactly where she said they would be." For a moment, Nolan could not speak. The old woman in the photograph, the one Vanessa had dismissed as a ghost attached to a rotten cottage, had reached across years of ridicule and silence, and placed a living bird back into the hands of the world. Laurel looked toward the house. "Your grandmother did not simply record what was disappearing," she said. "She left a way back to what everyone thought was gone." Nolan looked down at Ridge. The German shepherd leaned into his leg, steady as a vow. And inside Nolan, something long frozen shifted, not breaking, but thawing. Dr. Laurel Keene did not call it a discovery tour. She called it a verification walk. Nolan Alder Whitaker liked that about her. Laurel did not dress wonder in ribbons before it had earned them. She came to the cottage with 2 graduate students, a weatherproof folder, a field notebook, and the same cautious expression she had worn the first day she opened Elowen's journals. The first student was Ethan Park, 26, narrow-shouldered and serious, with black hair tucked beneath a gray beanie and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He moved carefully, as if afraid the earth might object to being stepped on. The second was Marisol Vega, 24, compact and strong, with copper-brown skin, dark curls pulled into a tight braid, and quick eyes that missed very little. She wore a green rain shell and carried a camera with the reverence of someone carrying a newborn. Laurel led them down the old trail just after sunrise. Nolan walked beside her in his olive field jacket, worn boots sure on the frozen ground, Ridge moving ahead on the olive tactical leash. Silas Fenner followed with a walking stick, grumbling about young people, slick rocks, and the general foolishness of science that required walking before coffee. Mara Bellamy came too, though she insisted she was there only to observe. The former JAG lawyer wore her dark navy trench coat buttoned against the wind, black hair tied low, brown leather document bag slung over one shoulder. Her direct eyes watched the trail the way other people watched courtrooms. The forest was bright that morning. Snow clung to the north side of the pines, while sunlight poured through the branches in pale gold bands. Below the ridge, the Atlantic breathed against the rocks, deep and patient. Ridge worked the trail with calm purpose. He was not chasing destiny. He was reading the world in the language he knew best: scent, sound, pressure, change. The German shepherd paused near a cluster of lichen-covered stones, nose lifting, his ears angled toward the cliff. Then he stopped, not at the place Laurel had marked on her map, several yards before it. Ridge lowered his body and became absolutely still. Nolan knew that posture. It meant, wait. Laurel noticed too. "What is it?" Nolan held up one hand. The wind moved over the cliff edge. For a moment there was only water, pine needles, and Silas breathing through his nose like an annoyed old engine. Then came a sound so small Nolan almost missed it. A thin, bright cry from the stone. Marisol's eyes widened. "Bird call." Laurel's face changed. She moved slowly toward the cliff pocket, opened Elowen's copied page, and knelt beside a dark fold in the basalt. Ethan crouched behind her, glasses slipping again. Marisol raised her camera, then lowered it, suddenly aware that some moments should not be stolen too quickly. Inside the sheltered rock pocket was a nest. Not dramatic, not golden. Just grass, feathers, and 2 pale bodies tucked low against the wind. Laurel looked from the nest to Elowen's page. Her gloved finger trembled over a hand-drawn mark. "She noted this pocket," Laurel whispered. "Same exposure. Same rock shelf. Same windbreak." Silas took off his cap. Nolan did not ask him why. Ridge backed away from the cliff and sat beside Nolan, leaning his shoulder against the man's leg. That was the re-hook of the morning, though no one called it that then. The old K9 had stopped not where the humans expected proof, but where life was actually breathing. In that small hidden nest, Elowen's forgotten hand reached through time. and Ridge, with nothing but ears, nose, and instinct, had made them kneel at the exact place where the world had almost given up looking. They stayed only long enough to document without disturbing. By the time they returned to the cottage, someone else was waiting near the gate. Lily Harrow stood beside an old blue bicycle, cheeks pink from cold, phone clutched in both hands. She was 24, small and quick-looking, with light brown shoulder-length hair half tied in a messy knot. She wore a moss-green hoodie beneath a fleece-lined denim jacket, light blue jeans, low brown boots, and a canvas tote bag with flour dust on one side. She worked mornings at the bakery in town and ran the community page that mostly posted weather alerts, lost mittens, and pictures of boats at sunset. "I'm sorry," she said, almost before anyone spoke. "Mrs. Bell at the post office said Dr. Keene was here, and people keep asking what's happening, and I thought maybe if there was a careful way to show it." Her voice faded when Ridge approached. The K9 sniffed her boots, then her tote bag, then sat down. Lily looked at Nolan. "Is that good?" "For you," Nolan said. "Yes. For whatever pastry is in that bag, maybe not." Lily smiled nervously and pulled out a paper-wrapped bun for the humans. Ridge watched this transaction with wounded disbelief. Laurel hesitated at first. Mara laid out rules. No location tags for fragile nesting sites. No private divorce questions. No sensational claims. No footage of protected areas close enough for people to find them. Lily nodded through all of it. "I don't want to make it ugly," she said. "I just think people should know what your grandmother saw." That was why Nolan agreed. The video Lily posted that evening was 51 seconds long. It showed Nolan holding open one of Elowin's copied pages, his broad hands careful on the paper. It showed Ridge standing on the trail, wind lifting the black fur along his back. It showed Laurel kneeling beside a rock shelf and pointing, not at the nest itself, but at Elowin's drawing. It ended with Silas, old cap in hand, looking out over the cove while a line of text appeared. She watched when no one listened. The dog stopped where life was still waiting. By morning, the video had been shared across the county. By the second day, it had reached veterans groups, birding pages, coastal conservation forums, and more strangers than Nolan knew what to do with. Reporters called. Some wanted Elowin, some wanted Ridge. Too many wanted Vanessa. Mara handled them like a woman swatting flies with a legal pad. "This story is not a divorce circus," she told one regional producer on speakerphone while Nolan stacked wood behind her. "It is about land records, coastal ecology, and a deceased woman whose work deserves verification. Ask about the ex-wife again, and this call ends." The call ended anyway. The cottage changed after that. Not suddenly, not like magic, like a harbor filling one boat at a time. June Pike arrived first with soup and medical authority. She was 67, full-bodied, short silver hair neatly waved, kind-faced but stern-eyed. She wore a burgundy puffer jacket, thick white sweater, dark trousers, and black anti-slip boots, with a small first-aid bag clutched like a weapon. A retired nurse, she looked at Nolan's bandaged knuckle and said, "You are not made of granite just because you enjoy acting like a boulder." Then came Walt Harlan, 69, a retired carpenter with a sturdy frame slowed by age, a broad face, short silver beard, and gentle brown eyes. He wore a dark blue flannel shirt, earth brown canvas jacket, dark jeans, brown work boots, and an old tool belt that looked older than some governments. He stood on the porch, tapped one post, and said, "House is embarrassed. That's all. Needs hands on it." By Saturday, 3 local veterans had come to help clear the trail. One had a limp. One said almost nothing. One laughed too loudly at every joke until Ridge leaned against him, and the laughter softened into tears he tried to hide with his sleeve. Nolan understood that kind of man, so he gave him work. They built a safer wood rack, cleared fallen limbs, marked fragile trail sections. Walt patched the porch. June made everyone sit down when lips went blue. Lily filmed only what Mara approved. Laurel and her students cataloged without drama. Silas began writing a statement about the trucks he had seen in 1986. Each sentence costing him more than he admitted. Then Northglass called for a town meeting. It was held in the White Church Hall on Main Street, because the municipal room was too small for the crowd. The Northglass representative, Conrad Blythe, stood at the front in a black overcoat and polished shoes. He was around 50, tall and smooth-faced, with silver hair brushed back and a voice designed to sound reasonable while taking things apart. He spoke of jobs, responsible development, tourism, tax revenue, and the danger of letting emotional stories obstruct progress. He did not say greed. Men like him rarely used accurate nouns. A letter from Vanessa's attorney was read into the record. It suggested that Nolan's actions were financially motivated, emotionally unstable, and complicated by ongoing divorce proceedings. Ridge stood beside Nolan's chair through all of it. When Nolan rose, the hall quieted in a way that made his pulse climb. He was not afraid of men. He was afraid of being watched while something inside him shook. Ridge pressed against his leg. Nolan placed one hand on the dog's head. He played a copied recording of Elowen's voice, the part Mara had approved. The old woman's words filled the hall. Dates, warnings, the damaged lantern line, the slope after illegal cutting, the letters no one answered. Then Silas stood. His voice was rough, but it held. "I saw the trucks," he said. "I was afraid." Elowen was not wrong. Laurel presented her preliminary findings. Mara presented the boundary concerns and the need for review. Ethan and Marisol displayed maps. Lily stood at the back with tears on her cheeks and her phone lowered for once. No one cheered. It was better than cheering. People began to stand. A fisherman, a teacher, Cora Bell from the post office, a veteran with one hand missing 2 fingers. One by one, they asked the council to pause North Glass permits until the land, trail, and ecological records could be properly examined. By the end of the night, the council voted to suspend all pending approvals related to the Alder Cove access route and adjacent woodland. Temporary, Mara warned, but real. Outside, under the church lights, snow began to fall. Nolan walked back toward his truck with Ridge at his side, too tired to feel victory. Then his phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "I'm coming to Alder Cove. We need to talk." No signature. It did not need one. Nolan looked toward the dark road leading back to the cottage, where smoke would be rising from the chimney and the sea would be speaking below the pines. Ridge looked up at him, ears forward. Nolan put the phone away. "Not tonight," he said, and for once the past would have to wait outside in the cold. 3 months after the town meeting, Elowen Alder's journals were no longer treated as family relics. They were evidence. Dr. Laurel Keene and her research team verified enough of the records to make the state listen. The tide notes matched old weather logs. The lantern sketches matched forgotten county maintenance maps. The bird records matched field observations no one had thought to connect before. 6 months after that first video, volunteers had become regulars at the cottage. At 9 months, a coastal university signed an agreement to digitize the notebooks, photographs, maps, and recordings. At 1 year, Mara Bellamy completed the legal trust that protected the cottage, the woodland, the old trail, and the cliff access from being sold off piece by piece. At 18 months, Alder Watch Trail opened for limited seasonal tours. And after 2 years, Alder Cove Watch became an officially recognized nonprofit, built around 3 things the world had once ignored: coastal conservation, local history, and the healing of veterans who still woke at night with battles inside their bones. The cottage changed, but it did not become fancy. That mattered to Nolan. The roof was new now, dark and clean against the pines. The porch stood straight. The windows held glass instead of plastic. The stone fireplace drew well. The woodpile stayed dry, and a hand-carved sign beside the gate read, "Elowen and Jonas Alder Cottage, Alder Cove, watch inside." The old bedroom had become an archive room. Elowen's journals rested in protective cases. Copies were used for tours. The original tapes had been digitized, though the old cassette player still sat on a shelf because Silas insisted machines deserved retirement with dignity. Nolan was 45 now. He still wore his olive field jacket, dark blue cargo pants, red and dark blue plaid shirt, worn brown leather boots, and the old military watch on his left wrist. His face remained angular, his jaw clear beneath light stubble, his deep blue-gray eyes quieter than before. The silver at his temples had grown more visible, not as a sign of defeat, but like frost on a mountain that had learned to endure weather. Ridge was older too. The German Shepherd K9's black and tan coat remained thick and healthy, but silver had spread across his muzzle. He still wore his old dark brown leather collar with a small metal tag engraved Ridge. He moved a little slower on cold mornings, but his eyes remained sharp, intelligent, and deeply aware. Visitors loved him. Veterans trusted him before they trusted people. Scientists learned quickly that Ridge liked to sit directly in front of the archive room door. Laurel called it ethical review. Walt called it security. June Pike said Ridge simply had better judgment than most committees. Nolan called it Tuesday. On an early autumn morning, the maples near the road burned red and gold. The sea below the bluff shone blue under clean light. Nolan was repairing a handrail near the trailhead when Ridge stopped chewing a stick and lifted his head. A gray rental car rolled up the lane. Nolan knew before the door opened. Vanessa Whitaker stepped out. She was still beautiful, but less polished than she had once been. Her long camel wool coat was the same kind of elegant armor she had worn in Vermont, but it hung differently now. The cream turtleneck dress beneath it could not hide the sharpness in her collarbones. Her honey blonde hair was still arranged in soft waves, though the wind quickly loosened them. The thin gold watch remained at her wrist. The wedding ring was gone. Ridge stood. He did not growl. That was the first thing Nolan noticed. The old K9 simply moved to Nolan's side and watched Vanessa with steady eyes, as if she had become a weather pattern no longer worth fearing. Vanessa looked at the cottage, the new roof, the straight porch, the sign with Elowen and Jonas's names. Behind the windows, Laurel and 2 students were cataloging scanned maps. June was scolding Walt for climbing a ladder without telling anyone. Silas sat on the porch with coffee, old shoulders wrapped in a blanket, watching Vanessa as if history had walked up wearing expensive boots. "Nolan," Vanessa said. Her voice was softer than before. He set the hammer down. "Vanessa." She glanced at Ridge. "He's still with you. He always was." The words landed cleanly, no anger, no performance. Vanessa looked away first. For a moment, Nolan saw the ruins behind her face. Derek Sloan had left after the investment group tied to Northglass came under investigation. Some of the accounts she had taken from Nolan were frozen during financial review. The Vermont house had gone back to the bank. People who once smiled at her across polished tables had stopped answering calls. She had not come empty of pride, but she had come lower than she had ever imagined herself capable of standing. "I heard about the trust," she said, "and the nonprofit, and the documentary people. There are no documentary people inside the trust." "I know, I just meant." She took a breath. "I came to apologize." Nolan waited. Ridge sat down beside him. Vanessa's eyes shone. This time the tears were less perfect. "I did terrible things. I know that. Derek told me the structures were normal. He said you were unstable, that I had to protect myself, and maybe I wanted to believe it because it was easier than admitting I had become someone cruel." Nolan listened. Once, her tears would have made him step forward. Now he heard the spaces between them. "I lost the house," she said. "I may lose more. My lawyer says there could be questions about when certain funds were moved. I don't know what happens next." There it was. Not all of it, but enough. Need, dressed as remorse. Nolan looked toward the trail, where the first tour group of the morning waited near the pines. A retired Marine stood with one hand resting on the shoulder of another veteran whose eyes kept drifting to the ground. Ridge noticed and gave a low woof, not at danger, but as if reminding the man he had been seen. Vanessa followed Nolan's gaze. Something in her face shifted. She seemed to realize the cottage no longer revolved around what she wanted from it. It had become a place where broken people arrived, without needing to explain the shape of their breaks. That was the re-hook of the morning. Vanessa had come searching for leverage, but found a sanctuary guarded by the very dog she had once dismissed. And Ridge, instead of growling at her, turned his back and walked toward the waiting veterans, choosing the wounded over the woman who had made wounds into weapons. Nolan watched him go. Then he turned back to Vanessa. "Mara already handled the legal questions," he said. "The cottage was inherited property. The land is in trust. The nonprofit owns no personal profit to divide. And the financial transfers you and Derek made are being reviewed by people who understand numbers better than either of us." Vanessa swallowed. "I didn't come for money." Nolan did not answer. The silence was enough. She lowered her eyes. "Maybe I came because I don't know where else to go." That was the first honest thing she had said. Nolan felt no triumph in hearing it, only a tired compassion, fenced carefully by memory. "I won't give you money," he said. "I won't put your name near the trust. I won't let you use Ridge, my medical history, or my grandmother's work to protect yourself. That door is closed." Her mouth tightened, but she nodded. Nolan pointed toward the stone steps that descended toward the cove. "Every Saturday at 6, volunteers clear the lower trail. Seaweed, ice, broken branches, whatever the tide throws at us. If you want to do something that does not benefit you first, you can start there." Vanessa stared at him. "You want me to scrape steps?" "I want nothing from you," Nolan said. "That's the difference." He picked up the hammer again and walked toward the porch. The recognition ceremony took place that afternoon on the lawn above the cove. No stage had been built. Just a simple lectern, folding chairs, and the sea behind them. Cora Bell from the post office sat in the front row. June had brought blankets for anyone too proud to admit they were cold. Walt stood near the porch rail he had rebuilt. Silas held a photograph of Jonas and Elowen in both hands. Laurel spoke first about the science. Mara spoke about the trust. Lily Harrow, no longer quite as shy, recorded the event for the community page, careful as always not to turn reverence into spectacle. Then Nolan was asked to speak. He stood at the lectern with Ridge beside him. The old dog leaned against his leg the way he had in courtrooms of memory, kitchens of betrayal, and nights when breath had been hard to find. Nolan opened one of Elowen's copied journals. "My grandmother had no degree," he said. "My grandfather died with men calling him careless. This dog was called a burden. I was called unstable. This cottage was called worthless. This forest was called undeveloped." He looked out at the people gathered there. Maybe that is how the world takes things. First, it gives them small names. The wind moved through the pines. Nolan rested his hand on Ridge's head. But there are things that do not lose value just because someone is too hurried, too greedy, or too proud to kneel down and look closely. He closed the journal. This place taught me that. No one applauded at first. For a few seconds there was only the sea. Then Silas stood, then June, then Walt, then the veterans near the back. The applause came slowly like tidewater filling a hidden pool. At sunset, Nolan walked back through the gate with Ridge ahead of him. The cottage windows glowed amber. Inside, voices rose from the kitchen. June arguing with Walt, Laurel laughing, Silas pretending not to need another blanket, Mara speaking quietly with a county official near the archive door. Vanessa was gone. Whether she would return on some Saturday morning with gloves, Nolan did not know. He found that he did not need to know. Ridge stopped at the porch and looked back. Nolan stood at the gate, taking in the straight roof, the warm windows, the carved names of Elowen and Jonas, the pines bright with the last gold of evening. The cottage had not saved him because it was valuable. It had saved him because it had been faithful. Faithful to the woman who built with her hands. Faithful to the man whose name had been buried under a lie. Faithful to the dog who found what grief could not. Faithful to the soldier who thought he had come there with nothing, only to discover that nothing was sometimes the doorway God used when every other door had been stolen. Ridge gave one impatient bark. Nolan looked at him. "All right," he said, and smiled. Together, they went inside. Sometimes what looks like the end of a life is only the place where God quietly begins a new one. Nolan thought he had lost everything. His home, his marriage, his name, and the future he had tried so hard to build. But God had not forgotten him. In the ashes of betrayal, there was still a road. At the end of that road, there was an old cottage, grandmother's truth, and a loyal K9 who knew where to stop when Nolan no longer knew where to go. That is how miracles often come to us. Not always with thunder. Not always with angels in the sky. Sometimes a miracle comes through a dog leaning against your leg when your heart is breaking. Sometimes it comes through an old letter, a forgotten house, a stranger willing to help, or a quiet morning when you find the strength to take one more step. In our daily lives, we may all face seasons when people misunderstand us, leave us, betray us, or call us worthless. But this story reminds us that God can still use the things others throw away. He can use an old house, an old wound, an old memory, and even an old dog to lead us back to purpose. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us about a loyal animal, a miracle, or a moment when God helped you stand again. And if you believe stories like this still matter, please subscribe to Veteran and Dog so we can keep bringing you tales of courage, loyalty, healing, and faith. May God bless you, protect your home, comfort your heart, and remind you that even when life takes something from you, His grace can still lead you to something greater.